when you sign on as a franchisee, I say, here's our list of real estate brokers. Let's make sure we're all on the same page. Let's get educated. Let's talk through financials, but also let's get started with project management now so that when we start negotiating, we can get spaces in front of them quickly and we can start to talk about what is the true cost or the estimated cost of this specific location. Just because we have so many levers to pull, we want to make sure that it fits everybody's ideal goals at the end of the day.
Jared Breen, what's up?
What is going on?
It's good when you start the podcast, we're already laughing. You know?
I know. That's just our office for you.
Humor with a touch of crazy.
Always.
That's right.
Always.
Core value. What you been up to, man? You got 3 kids now.
Oh, man. Yeah.
How's life at home?
I think it's as good as it can get with 3 kids, 3 and under.
Ugh. So how's Bear doing with 2 young siblings?
Bear, my oldest son, he's a good kid. Like, he's a great big brother, and he's really stepping into like the helper role already, which is
that's awesome. And he's 3?
Yeah.
Ish.
Yeah. He gets a lot of joy out of like helping mom do things.
That's
so that's
awesome.
Really.
And Olivia, how's she doing with it? She's what, year 18, over 18 months?
She's 19 months.
Yep.
Yeah, she's 19 months, and she's a spitfire. Like, but she's been great with the little one, which was kind of like she was our wild card. We were like,
it's always the middle child.
This is either going to go really well or really poor. It's gone very well thus far. So praise God for that.
The baby's sleeping pretty good, right?
She's a great newborn. We've been blessed with good sleepers.
Yeah. That's
No
a
doubt.
big deal, man. Because you get like a colicky baby or something, it's like your life is not fun.
Yeah, for sure. Which I'm sure there's a little bit of favor in there, nature and nurture. I've got a rock star wife, so that helps. She's type A and on it all the time.
Yeah, I know her. I get it.
Yeah.
For those that don't, she's a baller.
She is. She was born for it.
All right, so you're a dad of 3. You have to have a dad joke. I mean, come on.
All right, yeah. Yep, dad joke for the day. So a blind man walks into a bar.
You're right. Okay.
And then a table. And then a chair.
That's so bad.
They're the worst, aren't they? So good.
You know, speaking of stuff like that, like, did I ever tell you I used to date a girl with a lazy eye? Come on. Like,
I just didn't know that's what was coming. No, you didn't.
I didn't?
No.
No, yeah. Well, it was weird. You know, I had to break up with her. I always felt like she was seeing somebody on the side. I'm so sorry, you guys. I really am.
Yes.
We are going to talk about something serious today. All right, the fun's over. Maybe. But we're going to talk about all things like understanding your lease and mainly like the financial terms, your deal terms around your lease, because it's interesting, right? I think if you haven't done a commercial lease, a lot of the phrases that we throw around the office that we're used to, people don't know, you know, TI, FF&E, this and that. I mean, there's just things that happen, and we're going to try to in the best way possible. I'm going to interview Jared on like what's the current landscape, what are we seeing, and then what are deal terms and how do they manifest themselves? Because there's lots of ways to structure the negotiations around a lease as it pertains to the finances,
Yep.
right? And so we'll talk about all things that. So let's start with just state of the market. Like what are you seeing right now in market as far as getting leases signed, finding real estate? What's that look like?
Yeah, well, I mean, going back 2020, post-COVID, retail in the markets that we're going into have been traditionally pretty tight. I will say in the last 8 to 12 months, we've been able to get into lease negotiations considerably quicker than we did 2 years ago.
What's a good time for you? And again, it's not a claim on what's actually going to happen, but like, what are you happy with realistically to get into lease negotiations?
To get in, I guess 2 parts, either lease negotiations in the first, I would say if you can find a space and get into lease negotiations in the first 3 months, that's a major win.
Okay. So the first 3 months to get, and you're through LOI. Now you're talking about leasing.
Yeah.
Got it.
And so having a lease signed somewhere at the 6-month mark from lease or from franchise agreement execution, that would be pretty darn good.
Okay.
That's kind of like the gold standard for us.
And that's the pace, because you've got 2 people on your team. For those that don't know, he's got 2 studio coordinators on under Jared that are doing weekly check-ins and checklists and everything else to keep the thing moving, right?
Yes. Yep. Alongside our brokers who we meet with weekly as well. So
right. And if you go with the Gold Glove, if you go with Build 'em as a project management company, like we're also in touch with those guys.
Yes.
As well, right?
Yeah. We meet with all vendors that are involved in the pre-opening process. We have a weekly cadence with all of them.
Okay, cool.
Yep.
So you're finding we're getting to lease negotiations much quicker than we used to.
Yeah. I mean, we've had a couple recently that have signed leases in the first 3 to 4 months, which is lightning fast for us,
right?
Comparatively,
right,
relative to how it was 2 years ago.
Yeah, and that was one of our objectives. So when you were moved into this seat specifically, and then built a team, it was like, look, we've talked about this on the podcast a million times. We obviously talk about it corporately. There's an upfront franchise fee, but based on the fact that we work with a lot of franchise consultants, and then we have an outside sales team, they both have to be paid, and they're all paid from that initial franchise fee, which leaves very little meat on the bone for us. So it's our main objective, which is perfect alignment with the franchisee. Let's get them a good spot, a good lease, but let's get them open.
Yep.
And get them to revenue, because that's how we get paid. So I love the alignment of the business model. And so that was one of our big objectives for people that didn't know, was to get clubs open faster, right? And one way is the first step is let's find you a spot that's viable. Let's get an LOI going. If we're happy with the terms, let's get into lease negotiation and try to sew this thing up.
Yeah. And I think for us, I think it's been very helpful. Now we've had a couple of brokers that we've worked with for multiple years, which is nice. They understand our brand. They understand what we're looking for, and they can then talk to landlords eloquently, right? And explain. Yeah. Because fitness, I think, gets a really bad rap, maybe sometimes rightfully so, but with landlords, because they always jump to the same thing, which is okay, it's a bunch of parking spots taken up, younger demographic, and that's not necessarily bad, but it may not boost the other tenants in that center.
It's not us at all.
And that's not
if you're thinking like a Planet Fitness, a $9 a month gym,
right?
That's taking up a lot of parking spots. It's a different crowd and we're going into retail areas that are a target-rich environment for people 45 to 65 with a lot of money. So that's probably not the right target market, because the shopping centers we're going into also are targeting those same types of people with different services: dog grooming, nail salon, massage places, high-end grocery store, whatever those things are, right? High-end services and products. And so that may, the discount gym, if you will, like them or not, doesn't really fit that avatar, but I think they immediately go there. And then it also comes with a lot of parking spaces, noise, right? If you have somebody next to them, there's this thumping music. And I think we've talked about this on previous podcasts, but we have a one-sheeter, and we have had people be able to get a lease in a mixed use environment, which means you're underneath a condos or apartments. Yep. Because we only have 6 at a time, right? And the music's not loud enough because we're coaching, where it's not like a class-based concept where it's doom, 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 So, and we've had no complaints from anybody. So it's been great.
No, and talking to landlords, so I've hopped in on a few landlord conversations just to educate them on who we are, because I think that's helpful for us as a brand. Obviously,
we have a one-sheeter that we give to them as well, right?
Yeah, so we have a one-sheeter, but our brand manual is also very detailed as well. And so we've already... We know how loud our music is. We know the decibel level that we play it at. And
I remember sitting in a meeting where you were saying, well, the acceptable decibel level for most, and then you compared it to other types of businesses and where our decibel level was. I'm sitting there looking at you like you're speaking a foreign language. I was like, how do you know all this? But I didn't know we had done all that homework. That's really good. I mean, it makes sense, right?
And we build out our spaces to that too. So there's already some safeguards in play for the landlord and the existing tenants to know that our music and vibration levels are going to be essentially null and void by the time we're done with our build out.
Right.
Yeah. And that's helpful. I mean, that's what everybody wants to hear.
Yep.
Okay, you're a gym, you're serving the same demographic that the rest of our tenants are serving, and you're not going to be loud or take up a bunch of parking spaces. It's okay,
check. Yeah.
Okay,
come
great.
on in, right?
Yeah.
Well, that helps for sure.
Yeah.
So let's say we find a spot. We're getting down to lease negotiations at this point, right? So and LOI is part of that, not just letter of intent if you haven't heard that acronym. That means you sign something with a landlord saying you kind of agree to the basic terms, but then you get into a little bit more of the negotiating in the lease. It typically is close to where the LOI is, but what are the things that can be negotiated in a lease and things that we're looking at on behalf of our franchisees?
Yeah. So
I'll say we, it means the real estate vendors and us.
yeah, there's a few big things that we're always looking at. Base rent, so cost per foot, tenant improvement allowance, or TI or TIA, depending on who you're talking to, tenant improvement allowance, and that's the money that is reimbursed to you from the landlord for your build out. So typically speaking, they're going to offer you a dollar amount that reimburses you for your efforts put into the build out.
Okay, so they're contributing to the cost of the build out and they pay it after everything is complete.
That's correct.
Got it.
And then the third one is the rent abatement period. So how much time from the time that we execute the lease until we start paying rent. So those are the three things that we're always looking at. And those are the three most impactful levers in the LOI and lease negotiations.
Talk about how those are related to each other. Because I get where you're going now. I'm thinking, okay, so just logically, if a landlord agrees to cover more as a percentage of the expense of the build out, they may not be willing to budge, say, on the rent or give you any rent abatement, which just basically means free rent, right?
Yeah.
But they may not want to contribute to the build out at all, and they might give you incentives in the way of lower rent or no rent for 6-8 months, whatever that is. Is that what you typically are seeing?
That's exactly right. Yeah, because every landlord has their own financial situation that they're in. So if they're not stacked on capital, they may say, hey, I don't have the TI dollars to give you. So either I'll give you a lower rent rate or I'll give you a longer rent abatement period. And vice versa. They may have the capital on hand. And they'll say, here's the rent that I want. I'll give you this amount of rent abatement, but I'll give you X amount of dollars more in TI.
Right. So they're just levers to pull.
Always.
Now, do you find that, because you've seen, 60-something leases by now and more coming? No, probably more than that. Right?
Over 100 now.
Yeah, so over 100 people in lease somewhere. Either they've signed it or they're in the process. Do those numbers usually work out to be the same? Does that make sense? Like, so if I was going to get a lot of landlord contributions, so TI, but then I had to pay like full market rate for rent, do those two things like average out? Like if you did the math on the rent, because it's usually a 5-year lease with a 5-year option. So in that 5 years, if I'm paying more rent, I mean, I'm sure you're looking at these, and our franchisees should be looking at these formulas. Like if I pay a little bit more rent, I pay it for 12 months times 5 years, so 60 payments. That's this much, but I'm getting this much in TI. And then if I didn't get that in TI and I just got lesser rent, does it always work out to be similar?
Pretty often.
Okay, cool.
Pretty often. Yeah. So I guess given some context around what would be the ideal lease term, I think is probably helpful, right? So what would be the gold standard? The gold standard for a good lease in this day and age would be essentially 120 to 150 days of rent abatement post permits approved. So that's our build out time. Okay. So 120 to 150 days after permits are approved, and TI that matches the cost per foot in rent. So for instance, if I was paying $35 a foot in base rent, also getting somewhere near $35 a foot in tenant improvement allowance with 120 to 150 days of rent abatement after I have permits approved. That would be like the gold standard. If you see that, that's a home run deal. You've nailed it. It doesn't always happen that way because of the financial barriers that a landlord might have, right?
Right.
And they've got their own plans, right, with the bank that they're trying to show different things. Just like when we're talking to an SBA, going through the SBA process and trying to get approved lending, right? We have different performance that we're showing them,
right,
to show our financial security. They're doing the same thing as well.
Okay, interesting. And like you said, gold standard would be enough rent abatement to get you through your build out, so you're not paying rent without revenue.
Correct.
You might for a month, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But for the most part, you try to squeeze that gap as much as you can. Also then some TI, and it would match the price per square foot.
Correct.
Okay, interesting. Well, good. Well, that gives some people, things to think about. I think about this through because we've got how that affects the initial investment cost, right? Well, if you're getting a lot of TI, you're really not getting it until after anyway, right? And so you really get, but what's interesting about this, I look at this because my main goal is like make sure we're on brand, we're headed the right way. And then if there is a role for me on the team, it's typically on the sales side, right? I look at it as something in the franchise agreement called the item 7, and it's sort of your job in your department to control the item 7. And so what happens sometimes is we'll have an outlier that will say get a cold dark shell, right? So it's dirt, it's not built out yet. And the landlord base may not have, to your point, they may not be flush. And so they're like, I'm not going to contribute to your build out. Well, your build out's going to be crazy expensive.
Yeah.
But your rent abatement might be a year, or it might be, who knows, right? It might be crazy rent abatement or really, really low rent on the back end of that. The only challenge that gives for us is I go back to Jared for that I'm like, geez, why do we have a range now in our item 7? Because there's always a range, and it's like, it might creep up, $50,000 to $70,000, on the next FDD. And it's like, because we had one or two outliers that did get a really good lease, but it wasn't represented in the item 7 because all it's showing is the cost to open.
Yep.
And there are franchises that will back out TI, right, from a lease. So if it's TI, that's one thing. But like if it's no TI, then we're going to show a really high build out cost, but we can't really show in that item 7 that they got rent abatement for 12 months, right? So it's a little bit confusing. And I know our item 7 in our current update this year for the FDD, the range went up on the high end because we had a few outliers that had situations like that. Yeah. They got a really good lease, though. That's the thing. So when people see it, they're like, oh, God, it's expensive. But they don't see the whole picture.
Yeah. Well, to go back to your question that you just asked a moment ago, it does usually average out. So you made a great point. So we were looking at one space. We ended up not moving on it, but it was a first generation space, estimating that it might be a build out as high as $250,000, which is expensive for our model. No TI, but 22 months of rent abatement. And at a $7,000 lease, if you look at that, 22 months, $7,000 a month, that's $140,000 back in your pocket that you don't have to pay in rent. So, if you take that into looking at your initial investment, you don't realize that capital on the front end, but over the course of 2 years, you've saved $140,000. So your build out cost, the way that we would be looking at it, I would be having the conversation with the franchisee is, it's a $110,000 build out cost ish, right?
Which would put us more in line with what we normally see if you got TI and you didn't get rent abatement, or you got a couple of months of rent abatement. Correct.
So then the question begs, do we have the capital on hand to make that deal work, right?
The franchisee.
Yes, correct. So that's the question that is always asked, which is why anytime a franchisee signs with us, within the first 2 weeks, we hop on a financial call to talk through the potential scenarios that they could be going through. And at this stage now, we've got a number of franchise locations that have they're in the process, have already gone through the process in that same similar market. So we can speak more relative to what they might actually see in their specific market, as opposed to just, taking a shot in the dark.
Yeah, we've had that recently. I think we've got someone who's secured a lease in sort of that Orange County area, right, Southern California, and that's the one that scares people because like, how much is it going to be? And his lease terms are pretty favorable, right? And so he's been able to share that with some of the other people in that market, and it's really good because I think people get really nervous. It's like, am I going to find space in my search area? And if I am, is it going to be exorbitantly expensive? And obviously, we have levers we can pull. We have pricing tiers. There's things we can do to mitigate. Like you could expect in a market where everything's more expensive, yes, the rent's going to be a bit higher, but you're also going to be charging a higher rate.
Yeah.
And so it should keep us in that 15%-ish is kind of what we're shooting for, over and under a bit. But the only other question I had around that, gosh, I don't even know if it's a good question. Is there anything more you want to add to that before I ask a really stupid question?
No, what I will say, you said our team is responsible for essentially taking care of the item 7. Since we're the pre-opening process, that's the initial investment, right? While it is important for us to be able to show a good range, I think we've done a good job of this as a franchise brand and as a whole, but specifically in this regard, is I don't want to do it at the sacrifice of a good opportunity for a franchise, right? So it's like I'm never going to kill a deal just because it doesn't look as favorable for us as the franchisor,
point.
right?
Yeah.
It's like I want to do what's right for the franchisee because long term that yields higher return than saying no, and we have to go back to the drawing board, start over, and
because it would blow up our item 7.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great point, because I think, again, that would be somewhat self-serving, because then a lower range, certainly lower on the top end in an item 7 can help sales, but you might then, if that's the main motivation for, say, you and your department, then you could actually, again, you could miss on a really good lease that had 2 years of rent abatement or something. Right?
Yeah, and that's why we have project management teams, because we want to ask all these questions before we execute on a lease. We want to spend as few amount of dollars negotiating on a lease and know exactly what might be to come. I shouldn't say exactly, what could come in the build-out process as we're negotiating, so that we can have honest conversations with the franchisee and make good decisions alongside them, right? So that's why when you sign on as a franchisee, I say, here's our list of real estate brokers. Let's make sure we're all on the same page. Let's get educated. Let's talk through financials, but also let's get started with project management now, so that when we start negotiating, we can get spaces in front of them quickly, and we can start to talk about what is the true cost or the estimated cost of this specific location. Just because we have so many levers to pull, we want to make sure that it fits everybody's ideal goals at the end of the day, however that is.
Yeah. Love it. Like, it's funny. As you're talking about this, I'm thinking, I had no idea. Good job, Jared. That's the weird thing about being a CEO, is you get dumber as your company grows, because you hire smart people like you, and you go deep dive into your functions, and there's all this like terminology and everything, and I pick up on it barely. But it's like I'm listening to you right now, learning as you're telling me, which is surprising.
That's good.
Yeah, I hope that doesn't discourage anyone. I'm climbing a tree. Make sure we're chopping in the right direction. How about that? Jared's chopping. He's chopping away down there. He's plowing through. I guess a bonus question, and it would just be something interesting, because I found it interesting. If someone does have an SBA loan, when does that funding happen for them?
Funding happens after permits, before construction. That's when
Do you have to have a
happens.
GC, like a general contractor's contract in hand?
Yeah, awarded.
And you submit all of that?
Awarded, yeah. So the timing of our process is very particular, because if you've signed your lease and now you're in your rent abatement period and we're working through permits, you don't want to get permits approved. Let's say you've got a great deal. You don't want permits approved. You've got now 3 to 5 months before your rent hits, and we're 2 months away from funding. That's a disaster. You're just eating into your.
So we're on
dollars.
top of that timeline. So when permits hit and we get that GC contract, are we getting bids during that time? So it all kind of comes to a head at one time?
Yep. So post lease execution, we go right into architecture. And when we submit construction drawings to whatever municipality we need to, that is when we start the GC bid process. So that's running a parallel path to the city's review on your permits. So that when ideally permits are approved, GC is lined up and ready to go. We pull permits and we get immediately to work. So we're mitigating as much extended time on that build out process.
Well, and this is like, you hear all of these things. This is like, I'm sitting here again thinking of it through the lens of someone who might be looking at franchising. This is why you get a franchise, right? Because like, this is an interesting process.
Yeah.
A lease is a long-term, really big investment, as is a build-out. So it's like, man, if you don't have somebody on your team, like finding red flags and finding opportunities to either spend less or get more, on the back end, it would be tough. And so that's when funding happens. And so someone needs to be able to cover that ramp, right? So you pay the initial franchise fee and you don't get funded until blank, but there are things that are happening before you get funding where you are still deploying capital, which is why in our franchise documents, it will say you have to have a certain threshold of net worth to qualify. And then some of that needs to be liquid. And it looked always to me that the percentage of liquid was high, but really it's estimated to cover that gap.
Yeah.
right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. And the bank, an SBA is always going to require a 20% capital injection from you. So our range that we have, our financial requirements is to cover that 20%. And it might be just over in some cases. Oftentimes, what goes over that 20% is reimbursable. So in that financial call that I have with franchisees when they sign, we talk about that, but I also have it fully mapped out of here's every item, every payment milestone, if you will, that you'll be paying up until the point of funding.
So they know exactly when the triggers are, how much capital is going to be deployed on what, all that's a clear path. It's all laid out. Yep.
Yeah. Because everybody might be, they might be moving capital around and, they're trying to do what's best for their own personal lives as well.
Right. And some people do a combo of some cash, some SBA. Some people do a ROBS, which is taking your 401k, rolling it over into another structure so that can fund it, which takes a bit of time. Yeah, it's interesting. And I guess all that plays into the lease as well. So you guys are dealing with a bunch of stuff up front, right?
Yeah. It's a lot.
Interesting. Well, I'm glad you're doing it, man. It's going really well. You have drastically reduced the time from signing to open, which is how we make money. And by the way, that's how franchisees make money. So appreciate you, man. Anything else you want to add?
No, it's been a blast. I didn't know I was going to enjoy real estate and construction as much as I have when we got started on this just about 5 years ago.
Yeah. Well, it's like problem solving at the highest level because there's lots of moving parts. And luckily we have a very systematic approach to it, which, we've built out software supporting it, the whole deal. And you've got a team that's like staying up, with all these little triggers and stuff. So yeah, I can say just from a franchisee experience standpoint, it's really good, right? I hear really good things. People are happy. They're getting into lease quicker. There's always a loss of momentum if you're like so fired up and you sign your franchise agreement and then things tend to slow down a little bit. And they do anyway. There's sort of ebbs and flows, like mad rush, slow down, mad rush, slow down. But I think it's nice if we can just get them there quicker. We've got some forums where franchisees are on there and they'll get on there and talk about, I already got my lease, and everybody's super excited, right? So anyway, keep up the good work. And I hope that helps you guys understand how leases work to a certain extent and what the levers are that we can pull, and why if you look at, say, our item 7 claims and the range looks to be too expensive, it may be a couple of outliers, it may be not, but we're not including in that number any landlord contribution, which is basically just a payback on that build-out cost, right? And we're not able to include any kind of rent abatement. So again, if it's a really expensive build-out and you're like, yikes, maybe that would apply to you if you don't have the capital. But if you do, maybe you're getting 2 years free rent on the back end. So anyway, just a different frame, different way to think about it. So appreciate you. Anything else?
No.
Great dad joke, by the way.
Thank you.
All right.
You too.
Peace.